written by conquerors or victors, but increasingly people ask if history is also being written by those who write smart algorithms or those with the smartest understanding of artificial intelligence. And that can indeed play a role in what you eventually see or consume, particularly in the digital age. So, how do we address this? And what are the ways to ensure, in some ways, that AI can really play a role for good, and to ensure that history and culture is surfaced in the manner that it does best for society and for future generations? So that's the question that I'm going to pose to someone who's spending a lot of time, energy, and effort working on this in the United States. I'm pleased to welcome Girish Venkataramani, director with Cruise. Earlier worked with NVIDIA and MathWorks. Girish is also a PhD in electrical and computer engineering from Carnegie Mellon, and much earlier from BITS Pilani right here. So, Girish, thank you very much for joining us. It's AM in California where you are, and PM in India. So, pleasure to speak to you. So, tell us about how when you talk about AI and culture, and before we come to how it works and why we should be talking about it, what got you interested in this particular branch?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Govind. It's a pleasure to be talking to you, first of all. I think it's a very interesting stage we are in our times, right? Like, if you think about it, AI as a methodology really got into the mainstream probably like 6, 7 years back, right? Like, we've had AI as a concept and as an idea for several decades. It's not until recently that we've actually harnessed its power. And, like, we are still discovering ways in which AI can be really effective and useful to our society. And there's a lot of ways it can disrupt us, but there's also a lot of potential for AI. I mean, it started with simple things like, identify people, animals, and whatnot, image classification. That was like the first big problem AI solved for us. And from there, we moved on. We've kind of felt like we now understand very well how to identify objects. That's like a great thing. Moved on to how we can apply that understanding. And then we now at a stage where we started to work a lot with speech and conversation. And that is also evolving in how we use that technology. And now we are seeing AI kind of start to get into these multidisciplinary aspects, right? Like, so where I work at Cruise is an example of that: self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles, AI-driven robotics of all nature, like in warehousing, it's becoming very common. And these are kind of like not a simple, like, tell me what's in the image kind of problem, but it's more multidisciplinary where we're trying to solve problems. And I think where we can really make an impact, I care a lot about history and culture, and I'm very interested in how we can witness it, understand it, and also kind of share our understanding with the rest of those around us. And I think, I personally believe that's a good thing for society in all. How can AI help us there? So that is the fundamental question we're at. And I think there's a few ways we can think about this problem, right? Like, so AI to preserve is a obvious kind of preserve our cultural heritage is an obvious direction, and there's a lot of good work being done. So AI can be very good at what we call predictive maintenance, right? Like, predictive maintenance is like when and everything dies in the end, right? Like, everything's going to kind of find its way to an end, including our art and architecture, especially. So predictive maintenance is the idea that you can actually restore something, and you know when is the right time to actually invest in that. So with architecture, there is a huge opportunity to be able to keep our culture intact. We're talking about architecture, buildings, or great heritage pieces of heritage from a millennium ago, right? Like, so this is actually happening in China for right now, where we are using all kinds of technologies like drones and whatnot to be able to map out 3D models of the Great Wall of China. to in areas where it's not possible to access the wall, where the terrain is very difficult to get to, and we are able to kind of build accurate models that can tell us when restoration work might be needed. And that's a great example of the use of AI, and this is true not just for China, but also any great monument we have, whether it's in India or rest of the world. So I think that's a really great opportunity where we can use AI to preserve a culture. And then, of course, we can go on to, digitization, which is like a huge effort across the
Right.
world in all the museums, and being able to kind of bring art and culture to billions of people who don't have access to it, right? And then there is the third dimension, I think, where we have this concept of AI as the creator itself, right? Like, so if you've seen NVIDIA's promo videos, you'll have this robot talk about the music it created or the artwork it created, AI as a creator. And so that's an example of where we are replacing humans as a creative entity. But we can also use AI as empowering the creator. So there's a choice we can make. So there's a whole world of opportunities in how we can use AI to better preserve and enhance our culture. I think we're just at the beginning. We've not done
Right.
too much, and there's a long way to go.
You talked about the physical applications of AI in the context of culture and restoration
Mhm,
of heritage. So on the Great Wall of China is a great example because it's so huge and so long that to know what's happening where and then use, let's say, drones to map it, then AI on top of it to understand it better. So that's one example. But let's talk about the history as is preserved in textbooks and now being digitized or has been digitized, and
mhm,
what really comes up. So, for instance, if I were to Google Taj Mahal,
mhm,
what will I see? And
mhm.
what will I see today versus what will I see maybe 5 or 10 years later, which is, let's say,
Yeah,
someone, the next generation.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
how are we
Mhm.
thinking about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think right now what we have is simple, photographs and imagery of monuments that we've kind of taken over the last many decades and millennium, right? Like, so that's kind of what we have in history is like the kind of the in the past kind of moments that we've captured and we've archived. What AI can do is provide a much more immersive experience, right? Like, so imagine that you're living in a little village in South America, and you would probably never visit India, but you're enthralled by architecture. How about if we can provide a more immersive augmented reality or virtual reality experience of the monument? So you can actually do a virtual tour of it. I mean, we are still very far from it. So a lot of great work on AR, VR going on in some of the big tech companies today. The realization of that is to be seen, right? Like, so there is the immediate applications of it, and in 5, 10 years, I do believe that there is a big incentive for these companies to invest in how we can provide. So AR, VR, AI, technology, digitization, they all go hand in hand. So if you remove any one piece, the whole thing falls down, right? Like, so we need to bring it all together to be able to give that immersive experience. So you don't have to travel to location on site for whatever reason it's even been destroyed, let's say. If we can actually create a full digital mapping, a 3D model of it, we have preserved it in technology,
Right.
so to say, not in our minds. So yeah.
Right. And how do you ensure that the integrity of this exercise is preserved so that people see things for what they were or
Yeah,
are and then form an
yeah,
opinion, as opposed
right.
to letting the opinion override what may have been historical fact?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And it's a hard question to answer, right? Like, so obviously we need regulatory bodies, we need some way of certifying these models. And in some sense, AI can provide that ability to kind of do a kind of a checker, right? Like a checker of whether this there's a golden model and your model, does it fit what we know about it, right? Because there are ways we can do that, but frankly, I think it requires more human intervention at that point, and we need our UNESCO-like bodies to kind of invest in that to certify and regulate how we preserve culture. Absolutely, I think that is a necessary element in this. And we can see that even today, right? Like if you take Wikipedia, it's a great example how we've regulated it, self-regulated it. There is no one body, but there is a very stringent mechanism. You can't put in any facts into Wikipedia and get away with it, right? Like it has a very strong way of kind of understanding who's adding content to it, how it's reviewed and how it's peer reviewed, and then finally published, right? Like, so we have some mechanisms we can learn from, but we will have to do that with art and culture in the future. Sure.
Right. So let me bring you back to the technology and the skills that one needs. You worked in NVIDIA and you work in Cruise. I mean, you're on the cutting edge. Culture and art will not necessarily, unless it's a passion for someone like you, draw the best talent into this field, nor will it
Yeah.
get the most resources. So how are we going
Yep.
to attack this in your mind, or how do you envision this?
Yeah, I think it will only take. It needs a strong will from those who have the abilities, right? Like, so we know, for example, Google, Microsoft, Carnegie Mellon, a few esteemed institutions are in fact investing in this area, and there is an incentive for them to do so. So we can even step back, right? Like we know there is like bias in AI, and that's what worries me more than anything else. Like, if we take a simple aspect of language itself, right? Language is a part of our culture. But language is also disappearing every day. Like there are obscure languages which nobody's going to talk anymore, right? Like we can take Sanskrit in India itself, right? Like, yeah, it's preserved and a lot of people know it, but not as many as we would expect, being the kind of one of the first languages in this country. And similarly, around the world, there are languages which are not even, they don't even have a script, which are starting to disappear. How do we preserve that? AI can play a great role in kind of making sure that we preserve our culture, and take language for that example. So I feel like a big part of this comes back to bias, right? Like, so your AI models are only as good as the data you have. If your AI models will perform as well as good as the data you have. The problem is, if you take culture, most of the data we have is probably biased towards Western or content that's been put online, but from places where people can afford it, right? Like, so these obscure languages, you don't have enough data, and it takes a willingness from companies and organizations which have the capability and the resources to be able to go find that data and add it to data sets that can be accessible. It takes a lot. I mean, there's no two ways about it. We need our big tech companies to take on some of these more humanitarian kind of directions, right? Like we cannot. I don't think art has always suffered from this. Art and culture has suffered from the fact that it is not very capitalistic. So how do we create incentive for companies to invest in democratizing data? And I think that's where it comes down to that. If we can create enough archival data, then the AI models will come. So it starts with data, in my opinion.
As you look at India and as you look at potential projects that could harness the power of artificial intelligence in the context of culture and history again, what comes to your mind?
Well, definitely, I think the restoration projects is critical, right? Like India has a lot of monuments that are millions of years old, and we are constantly up against that. So see, at the end of the day, the resources we can put into any one in a project is limited. So how can we make it most efficient? And that's AI can play a pretty big role in that. So there is, of course, the restoration piece, the digitization, as we've talked about, especially in India, where there are so many languages, so many literary gems and books in terms of books and poems and artwork and whatnot. And they're all in so many different locations, maybe small libraries in small towns to big museums in metropolitan cities. I think there is an opportunity to do something what has been tried in Europe once, which is a massive effort to coordinate our data, right? Again, like how do we bring data as the first order entity? We need to start there before we even bring in AI. So being able to collect data in all forms. So if you take one object, let's say the Taj Mahal, as you brought up, we can actually have our drones and cameras take as much footage to kind of create our 3D models. We have archival footage and pictures and photographs. We have books written about it. We have content around Taj Mahal in so many different forms. How are we going to connect them together, right? Like that's the first question. And that requires us to kind of create the databases and cross-calibrate against them. And that's where AI can play a big role. So first is collection of data. It has to be a massive data collection exercise, which goes to every museum, every library, every monument we have in India, and start to digitize that content. And once we can get to that massive source of data, then we can start to apply models to cross-calibrate them and really have a full understanding of the history of India. And if we can do that well, we can even kind of have a sense of what it was when the Taj Mahal was being built. What, you know, based on our knowledge of what has happened by reading the books that we have, we can actually recreate the story of Taj Mahal in a really honest way. I mean, we have the opportunity to do that. But yeah, it takes a lot of willingness and resources, and needs to be funded by the government, by the big tech industries who have the talent to be able to pull off something like this.
Right. And are there any projects that you're involved with, even where you are right now, which could inspire us in some ways or give us some ideas about how this could be done? And I'm aware, while I was reading up, that there are some non-profit initiatives which are trying to do this. But
Yeah,
do you see that coming elsewhere?
I'm Yeah, I think that is the only way we are doing it right now, through nonprofit, right? The problem with nonprofit is, AI is hard, right? Like to actually know how to build good AI models is not simple, and you need to have the right talent, and the right talent who can do this for you are in big tech companies or in the market where they're needed. So I think I see a fundamental disconnect there. How can we encourage our AI talent in the tech industry, whether in India or in the US, to kind of contribute towards these events? So my company, for example, and many other companies, like I said, Microsoft, Google, they all do this. There is there are these projects like the 1% project, right? Like so. Set aside 1% of your company's revenues for these kind of more humanitarian and social projects, right? Like that, and how we use the money could be decided differently. So we have to encourage our company. So Cruise is involved in this, and we've, I mean, it's not specifically in the realm of culture, but we kind of did help get food and resources to the needy during the pandemic, right? Like we used our vehicles to kind of do multiple million food deliveries, right? Like so, we had the ability, and we set aside some, perhaps some revenue which may not be significant to these companies, but really significant in the realm of these humanitarian projects. And that's how I see this starting, right? Like it needs the willingness of these companies to say, okay, we're going to provide some resources and some talent which can help these nonprofits and government initiatives to kind of start up really ambitious projects. And I think that's the beginning.
Right. And last question, Girish. So, as you got pulled into this world, which is a little different from your day job, so to speak, or perhaps is a little different. Was there any specific monument or project that attracted your attention, and which, in some ways, for you is your holy grail, so to speak, in
Yeah,
an AI holy grail.
yeah. Well, there's many things, right? Like definitely, I love great architecture, and I remember one of the Frank Lloyd Wright is one of my really revered architects that I followed, and I've kind of visited many of his sites. And I remember, so I was living in Pittsburgh in Carnegie Mellon when I was doing my PhD, and there was this place about an hour away from Pittsburgh called Falling Water. I mean, it's a great piece of architecture where,
I've seen
you
pictures.
know, yeah, right. Like, so Falling Water is so special. I mean, I think Frank Lloyd Wright did this all the time, but he really tries to create architecture that blends in with the environment that it's in. So there's these woods and this river flowing by, and he created this house which is almost, you could miss it if you were hiking by, right? Like so, but it had all these cantilevers and these trees which would appear into your living room and whatnot. Beautiful architecture, great concept, but not very sustainable, right? Like every time you go there, there is some kind of restoration project going on, right? So how often do we do that? And that's something which which has always been on my mind. And I come to India, and of course, if you go into our Ajanta caves or Elephanta caves, we constantly see the need for restoration, right? Like especially where there is no light and where there is the air is different, your sculptures will start to deteriorate. So I do have an interest in our sculptures and architecture, so I gravitate towards that. And we can go to Red Fort, for example. That's another example of where I think restoration is badly needed. So we can every kind of monument I visit, I feel, wow, this is great, but I wonder how it was the year it was built, right? Like there is a difference, and we know there is a difference. How well are we restoring it? Are we restoring it per the vision of what it was created on? That's always a question for me. So I'd love to see us play a role in better preservation from that perspective.
Right, and that's a wonderful question to ask. What was it like when it was really built, and what can AI do today to help us better understand that and
Yeah,
connect us better with
exactly.
our past and thus our future?
Yes, indeed.
On that note, Girish, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, Govind. Thank you.
Thank you.